Willow Baker had never intended to be noticed. After years of quiet work as a private environmental compliance contractor, evaluating soil safety and writing reports for obscure government bids, she had carved out a life that suited her temperament. Isolated, quiet, and far removed from the tangled mess of city bureaucracy. Her land sat a good 10 miles past the last official street sign, nestled against a forgotten stretch of road flanked by dead farmland and brittle pine trees. She had inherited the property from a distant uncle, a man she barely remembered but who, in his final act, had left her something few people in modern America could claim. Undisputed, private land that sat outside any community jurisdiction. No governing board, no neighborhood associations, no random leaflets left on her gate about voting dates or approved exterior paint palettes. For Willow, it was peace, not just silence, but the kind of existential freedom that let you breathe deeper. She had converted the property into her base of operations. Nothing elaborate, just a single-story house with reinforced walls, underground rain collection, and a solar grid that powered her work equipment. It was functional, modest, and entirely hers. Every tree on her boundary was tagged with a small metal disc, her own markers denoting the property line in a way far more precise than anything from a zoning office. And until recently, no one had cared. Then came the sign. At first glance, it looked like a misplaced memorial plaque. Brass, weatherproof, bolted to a rough wooden post. She found it 2 steps past her main gate. Memorial Sector 7. Quiet Ground of Honor, it read, with no contact number, no sponsor, just an official-looking seal she didn't recognize. Confused, she checked her mailbox. Nothing. No notice, no explanation, not even junk mail. Assuming it was some sort of prank or mistake, she pried the post from the dirt, leaned it against the gate, and forgot about it. 2 days later, the sign was back, and this time it wasn't alone. A plastic floral wreath had been hung on her gate. On her eastern boundary, 3 metal stakes had been hammered into the dirt with orange tape fluttering in the wind. At first, Willow thought it might be a county survey, but when she checked the municipal records, her parcel showed no recent activity. That's when the dread began to settle. Not as a dramatic panic, but as a slow, cloying awareness that something had begun. Something official. Something done quietly and deliberately. By the time Willow returned from a brief 2-day field assignment across the county line, her land had changed in ways she could not have imagined. The moment she turned off the main road and onto the dirt path leading to her property, she saw 3 sedans parked along the eastern perimeter, their windows tinted and front grills marked with small vinyl decals depicting a white dove above a yay, laurel branch, something between a church logo and a non-profit seal. Near her mailbox stood a man in a black windbreaker and dress pants, holding a clipboard and speaking into a Bluetooth headset, gesturing toward a pair of workers in neon vests who were unloading folding chairs from the back of a trailer. A white tent had already been assembled just outside the tree line, and beneath it stood a tall, narrow table draped in purple cloth with a brass-framed photo resting on top. The image showed an elderly woman she didn't recognize, surrounded by fake flowers and candles still flickering in their glass cups. Nearby, the sign she had removed just days before had returned. This time planted deeper, its wooden post wrapped in clear sealant to protect against weather damage. Willow parked her truck at the base of her gravel driveway, stepped out slowly, and approached the man with the clipboard. He greeted her with a bright, bland smile and said, "You must be the property custodian. We're right on schedule." She told him she owned the land, not just managed it, and asked what exactly was happening on her parcel. His smile faltered but didn't disappear. He flipped a page on his clipboard and responded. "According to our site documentation, this zone has been reallocated under the Immediate Spiritual Allocation Directive, subsection 19C, which allows designated areas to be repurposed for urgent memorial needs under religious charter." Willow asked again, more firmly, who gave him permission to enter private property. He offered a printed notice from what he called the council, a 1-page letter with a watermark of the dove and laurel logo, signed by a name she didn't recognize, and stamped with a vague municipal-looking emblem she couldn't immediately verify. It stated that her land, by recent regional annexation, now fell within the extended community boundary and had been earmarked as a suitable location for a satellite tranquility field. In simpler terms, they were building a cemetery. On her land. She left the conversation cold, eyes forward, jaw locked, and walked directly up her driveway. Her gate was wide open, unlocked and tied back with a piece of plastic twine as if to welcome guests. Inside, the changes were worse. Her open backyard, once raw brush and scattered pines, had been methodically cleared. A rectangular trench had been dug out, no more than 3 feet deep, and surrounded by small, laminated placards reading things like "Reserved the Holloway Family" and "Lot 3, Dedicated in Eternal Peace." A portable toilet had been placed near her. Tool shed and a roll of artificial grass lay half unrolled near the trench. Willow scanned the horizon of her own backyard and felt a rare, pressing heat rise in her chest. Not rage exactly, but something deeper, something primal. This wasn't just intrusion, it was desecration. She spent the next several hours making calls. First to the sheriff's office, where a dispatcher told her the situation sounded like a zoning dispute, and redirected her to the community planning office. There, after 3 failed transfers and a long hold, she was told someone would review the documentation and get back to her within 5 to 7 business days. When she explained that people were physically on her property, digging holes, installing what looked like graves, and constructing memorial infrastructure, the voice on the other end simply asked, "Did they display aggression or damage your home?" When she said no, just unauthorized use of land, the woman sighed and replied, "Then it's a civil matter. You'll have to file an injunction if you want to stop it." Willow wasn't naive. She knew civil processes could drag on for weeks, even months. By that time, there would be full ceremonies, grieving families, and perhaps even legal arguments claiming sacred use or spiritual servitude. The more she read into immediate spiritual allocation and regional chartering laws, the more she realized it was a niche clause tucked deep in outdated bylaws, likely forgotten by most, but still technically active. Someone had dusted it off and used it as a battering ram. Later, she reviewed the footage from her property cameras. Though partially obstructed by the trees, the playback showed coordinated arrival. 4 vehicles, each arriving one after another, moving with precise rhythm. They weren't casual opportunists. This was planned. They had blueprints, schedules, folding tables, and bottled water. They had protocols. This wasn't chaos, it was administration. The camera also captured something else. A woman, heavy-set, dressed in a floral blouse and bright sandals, arrived alone, dragging a small red wagon filled with urns. Plastic, unmarked, and sealed. She placed them in a line near the trench and arranged them like chess pieces. After finishing, she stood at the edge of the dirt, raised her hand to her heart, and muttered something too soft to be captured by the mic. Then she walked toward Willow's porch, set a casserole dish covered in foil on the steps, and pinned a note to the front door. Willow paused the footage and walked to retrieve the actual note, which she had ignored earlier in her frustration. The handwriting was large and curling. It read, "Thank you for your generosity. The Lord works through those who stay silent." That night, Willow didn't sleep. She stayed by the window, lights off, watching the shadows crawl across the half-cleared land that no longer felt like hers. The tent remained illuminated into the late hours, powered by a humming portable generator she hadn't seen anyone bring in. She watched as more folding chairs were arranged into neat rows and tall garden torches were lit near the trench. No one else came that night, but the eerie quiet only heightened the sense that she was no longer alone on her own soil. Her land had been claimed by people who walked through it with ceremony and purpose, as though her presence were a minor footnote in a larger design they had every intention of completing. The next morning, Willow drove straight to the county records office. She wanted to see with her own eyes whether any legal changes had actually occurred regarding her property. After a long wait and several unhelpful clerks, she was shown to a terminal where parcel data could be reviewed. Her lot, once distinctly marked as a privately owned, non-jurisdictional parcel, now appeared under a larger shaded section titled Community Stewardship Boundary Zone B, Active. She didn't recognize the label, and when she asked for documentation on when this change had occurred, the clerk mumbled something about pending digitization, then handed her a form to submit a request for access. No one could give her a definitive answer. The deeper she dug, the murkier it became, as if the entire shift had taken place through back-end systems without proper legal review or notification. Returning home, she found her gate open again. This time, it wasn't plastic twine that held it. It was a new padlock, unfamiliar and industrial, keeping the gate wide and fixed in place. Her own padlock, the one she had installed 2 years prior, was missing entirely. She drove in slowly, not wanting to provoke anyone, and parked closer to her house than usual. The tent had been expanded. A second trench was now visible, and 2 heavy men in dark suits stood near its edge, talking casually and sipping from paper cups. A small laminated schedule hung on a staked board nearby, listing time slots and names. 3 ceremonies were planned across the coming weekend. One of the names caught her attention immediately. Miriam Baker, her grandmother. Deceased nearly a decade ago and buried, as far as Willow knew, in northern Wisconsin. Her blood ran cold. She stepped out of her truck and approached one of the men, demanding to know who authorized the use of her grandmother's name. He squinted at her like she was the one intruding. With an exasperated tone, he said, "We don't choose the names. Families submit them through the registry." Willow responded that no one in her family had done so, and that this was a violation of both privacy and law. He shrugged and told her to speak to the registry office, wherever that was, then turned back to his drink. When she asked if they had any identification, permits, or even contact details of who employed them, he simply walked away. At this point, Willow did what many wouldn't think to do. She hired a private property attorney that same afternoon. She didn't want drama, lawsuits, or attention. She wanted results. Her lawyer, a terse, soft-spoken woman named Gloria Cohen, reviewed the footage, the documentation, and the new property maps with the kind of silence that only well-paid professionals exhibit when their gears are turning fast. Gloria made 2 calls that same day, one to the state registrar's office and one to a real estate law contact in the capital. By evening, she had enough to file a temporary cease and desist letter to the so-called registry group operating on Willow's property, citing misuse of private land and trespassing under contested annexation status. The letter was emailed and hand-delivered the next morning. The response wasn't fear or compliance. It was escalation. That afternoon, Willow returned home to find a single police cruiser parked in her driveway. A deputy leaned against the hood, eating a sandwich. When she introduced herself and asked what he was doing there, he told her there had been a report of hostile behavior toward religious staff. Willow explained the situation calmly, showed her ID and property deed, and even offered to walk him through the security footage. The deputy, to his credit, seemed uneasy and admitted that he wasn't sure why he had been dispatched at all. After a short conversation, he left without incident, but the message was clear. Someone was trying to frame her as the aggressor. The final straw came the next morning, when Willow walked outside and found the trench. Not the artificial one, but a new, narrow cut carved into the far end of her property, now lined with 10 small urns, all bearing printed labels with various surnames. A printed note rested on top of one. Placement finalized. Blessing to follow. Please keep the area undisturbed. Do not interfere with sacred grounds. Her land had been turned piece by piece into a mock cemetery without legal foundation. And despite everything, her calls, her footage, her lawyer, it continued as if she were invisible. She didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't march into the tent to confront whoever dared pretend they had a right to be there. Instead, she walked back inside, poured herself a glass of water, and sat at her desk. Then she opened an encrypted email client, typed a name she hadn't used in years, and included one short line. Your people might want to look at the attached footage. We have movement here. She uploaded the video of the heavyset woman in sandals, the same one who had placed urns by hand, pinned a note to her door, and arranged the fake remains like trophies. There was something about her, something off. Not just in her presence, but in the way she walked through Willow's property like she already owned it, like she was preparing it for someone else. Willow didn't know her name yet, but she had a feeling that if anyone could find out, it would be the person on the other end of that email, and once they did, things would begin to change. Not because of noise, but because some doors once opened lead to quiet consequences. The reply to Willow's encrypted message arrived less than 24 hours later, though it didn't come in the form of a reply at all. There was no direct acknowledgement, no thank you, no hint that her message had even been received. Instead, that afternoon, a silver SUV she didn't recognize pulled into her driveway and idled with the engine running for a full 5 minutes before someone finally stepped out. The man was tall, plain, almost deliberately forgettable in appearance. Khaki jacket, pressed jeans, clean shoes, no visible badge, no business card, and no introduction beyond a simple question. "Is there somewhere we can talk inside?" He didn't ask. Permission to enter. He waited for it. And Willow, recognizing something familiar in his economy of movement and quiet certainty, stepped aside and let him in without a word. Inside, she offered him coffee, which he declined. He remained standing while she sat. Without opening a laptop or pulling out a notebook, he began speaking in a measured tone, stating facts instead of asking questions. He told her that the registry operating on her property had been flagged 2 years ago in an internal audit. Not for fraud exactly, but for inconsistencies in documentation related to parcel reassignment, faith-based redevelopment, and religious use. Charters that didn't align with federal databases. Most of these discrepancies were deemed too minor to warrant prosecution or even escalation. Until now, when Willow's footage was reviewed, something in it triggered a match, not in a public system, but in a confidential archive connected to a past investigation. He didn't explain what that meant, but she didn't need the details. She'd worked long enough adjacent to bureaucratic machinery to understand when something moved from paperwork to priority. He asked for access to her cameras, which she granted. He asked to walk the property alone, which she allowed. She watched from the window as he moved slowly across the field, taking no pictures, making no phone calls, simply studying the layout and occasionally pausing to examine something at his feet. Footprints, tire treads, disturbed soil. He was on the land for nearly 2 hours before returning to her door. When he came back inside, he didn't offer reassurance and he didn't smile. He simply said, "You're not imagining this, and it's not just your property." That was all. He left immediately afterward, leaving nothing behind but the echo of his words, and a sudden suffocating sense that she had stumbled into a network that reached far beyond the quiet edges of her land. That evening, the tent was gone. So were the chairs, the torches, the laminated schedules. The plastic urns remained, but someone had moved them, clustered now in a pile near her fence line, as though abandoned in haste. The artificial trench had been filled in, poorly and without care, leaving a loose mound of dirt with shoe prints still visible in the soft topsoil. No note was left. No apology. No formal withdrawal. Just absence. A silence too coordinated to be accidental. Willow didn't touch any of it. She simply watched from her window and waited. 2 nights later, motion alerts from her cameras lit up her screen at 2:30 in the morning. She opened the feed and watched in real time as 2 figures dressed in dark clothing with hoods pulled tight entered her yard and began dragging the urns one by one into the woods behind her property. She didn't call the police. She didn't move. She let them finish. By dawn, the urns were gone. All of them. Gloria, her attorney, was cautious when Willow updated her. Gloria had been sending follow-up letters daily, pushing for formal recognition that the annexation of Willow's land had been executed improperly, but her efforts were being met with vague responses and, in one case, silence. Documents that should have existed, maps, authorizations, meeting records, simply didn't. Others showed signs of retroactive editing. One PDF even changed between downloads, its timestamps mysteriously inconsistent. "Someone's sweeping," Gloria finally admitted, her voice low and tight. Someone with access to more than county databases. Later that week, Willow received a certified envelope with no return address. Inside was a single folded document, an unsigned consent form dated 2 years prior, stating that the land had been voluntarily designated for interfaith spiritual development. The name on the form was hers, but the signature wasn't. Not even close. She scanned the document, ran it through handwriting verification software, and sent it to Gloria. Within an hour, Gloria called her and said, "That signature belongs to someone named Kelsey Barrett. I cross-referenced it with a witness statement from a case last year involving deed fraud. It's the same handwriting." She was never charged, but her name popped up in 3 unrelated real estate complaints. Willow printed the forged document and pinned it to her kitchen wall. She stared at it for a long time, the cheap ink bleeding slightly around the edges from poor reproduction. What disturbed her wasn't just the forgery itself, but the coordination. Someone had known what name to use, what form to fake, and when to insert it into the records just far enough back to make it seem plausible. It wasn't amateur work. It was procedural, layered, methodical. That night, as she locked her doors and powered down her systems, she found a second casserole dish on her porch. This one had no note. Inside, beneath the foil, was not food but soil. Clean, rich, sifted earth layered with small stones. At the bottom of the dish was a folded paper, just one sentence handwritten in that same familiar curl. The land remembers before the law does. Willow didn't touch it again. She slid the dish into a garbage bag, sealed it, and placed it in her shed. She wasn't afraid, but she was no longer confused either. Something old had been disturbed, and someone wanted it buried again. Quietly, permanently, and on her ground. 3 days after the urns disappeared and the tent was cleared, Willow began to notice the silence had a weight to it. The cars no longer came. There were no footsteps outside, no unfamiliar faces near the property lines, no signs of ceremonial intrusion. But she had lived alone too long to mistake stillness for peace. She understood the nature of retreat when it was strategic, and this silence, measured, collective, purposeful, was not the end. It was repositioning, a lull between movements. She focused her attention on the digital trail. With Gloria's help, she began requesting all property-related documentation that had been filed in the last 18 months. Most of the responses were generic, or came back with messages that the records could not be located due to migration, or were temporarily inaccessible due to scheduled maintenance. What little came through was riddled with inconsistencies. One zoning adjustment form was dated before the date of Willow's land purchase, and a usage permit issued in the name of Community Redevelopment Initiative No. 3 listed a project code that led to an empty link. Gloria called in a favor to someone she described only as a former colleague with municipal clearance. And the answer they got chilled both of them. Willow's parcel, along with 6 others in her district, had been flagged in an internal document as soft transition assets, a euphemism Gloria hadn't encountered before. When she followed up, her contact went quiet. The next day, Gloria received a notice that her credentials for regional document access had been temporarily suspended due to a technical inconsistency in her verification. Willow's mail, usually light, began to multiply. Thick manila envelopes with obscure logos, flyers for senior burial plans, offers to pre-arrange religious ceremonies, and promotional packets for spiritual land bequests arrived daily. At first, she threw them away, but one caught her eye. A letter from a non-profit she hadn't heard of, the Dominion Heritage Trust, thanking her for her recent commitment to eternal conservation and faith-rooted interment access. The letter included a digital code to access her partner portal and a certificate of appreciation with her name printed beneath a stylized cross and olive branch. She scanned the letterhead. The nonprofit was not listed in any federal registry she could find. Its address led to a suite inside a building that, according to satellite images, was under renovation and unoccupied. That evening, her property's power flickered 3 times, then cut out entirely. She switched to backup solar, checked her breakers, and found nothing wrong internally. Stepping outside, she followed the service lines that connected to the old utility box at the edge of her lot, tucked beneath a camouflage of saplings and bush. What she found was more precise than vandalism. The cable had been severed, but not slashed. It had been cleanly removed and the housing reattached with empty conduit to maintain appearances from a distance. She stared at it for a full minute, heart beating slow but hard. Someone had disabled her power and made it look untouched. She returned inside, made no calls, and simply added it to the growing file of details that didn't belong to coincidence. The following morning, her landline rang. It hadn't rung in months. When she answered, there was no voice, only static, and beneath it, a low hum that almost mimicked a dial tone but was somehow off. It lasted for 37 seconds before disconnecting. She checked her call log. No number. No record of the call ever arriving. When she informed Gloria, the lawyer told her to step back and let things settle. They're pushing, trying to make you act first. They want a misstep, she said. But Willow wasn't planning to misstep. She was planning to wait. What she didn't expect was for the next move to come through official channels. An unmarked sedan arrived, not with strangers, but with a local code enforcement officer she recognized from years prior. A polite man named Raymond, who once inspected her septic installation. He was polite again, almost apologetic as he handed her a citation notice. It listed 5 violations: unauthorized land modification, obstruction of a certified spiritual registry, unpermitted soil disposal, failure to comply with community aesthetic standards, and unlawful interference with public remembrance access. The penalties totaled over $12,000. Raymond looked embarrassed. He muttered, "This wasn't me. It was issued from higher up." She asked who filed the complaint. He hesitated, then said, "They're calling it a spiritual conservancy project now. Your land is marked for ongoing sacred interaction." Willow took the notice, nodded once, and stepped back inside without comment. She didn't slam the door. She didn't raise her voice. But she began the next phase of her response without delay. She sent 3 certified letters, one to the Secretary of State's office, one to the Inspector General of the Department of Interior, and one to a contact whose name she hadn't used in over a decade. She included timestamps, footage, names, documents, and above all, patterns. Each instance of overreach mapped and labeled. She didn't ask for help. She documented violation. She knew the value of pressure applied in silence. That night, she didn't sleep in her home. She parked down the road, lights off, and watched from a distance with binoculars and a thermos. At 2 a.m, she saw movement. Not a car, a figure. Short, round, slow-moving, wearing a long nightgown and pink Crocs. The heavy-set woman. She waddled toward the east fence line, pulled open the latch with ease, and entered without hesitation. She wasn't carrying urns this time. She carried a metal pail and a bundle of twigs wrapped in cloth. She walked to the patch of ground where the trench had once been, knelt slowly, and began to dig. Not deep, but deliberate, like someone following old instructions. Willow watched in silence as the woman completed her task, scattered something from the pail, then placed the cloth bundle in the shallow hole, and stood, brushing her knees. She looked up directly toward the road, eyes catching something in the dark. Not light. Movement. Willow sat still, hidden in shadow. The woman didn't call out. She simply turned and walked away, leaving the latch open behind her. In the morning, Willow returned to the site and excavated the shallow hole. Inside the bundle was a charred piece of what appeared to be an official registry seal, partially melted plastic, and beneath that, a half-burned photograph of her grandmother's house, taken decades ago, back when Willow was still a child. The handwriting on the back read, "Inheritance is not ownership. Land is borrowed." Willow replaced the dirt, covered the spot with a stone, and walked away. The escalation had moved beyond paperwork. They were no longer building anything. They were trying to unbuild her. Not just her claim, but her right to exist on her land as a presence rather than a placeholder. And they weren't done. Not yet. It began without fanfare. No sirens, no vehicles kicking up gravel, no demands through loudspeakers. Just a black SUV with government plates. Parked at an angle near the old fence post Willow had hammered in herself 8 years ago to mark the northern boundary. The man who stepped out wasn't the one she'd met before, but there was a resemblance. Same quiet posture, same jacket that looked casual but wasn't. Same face carved into neutrality by years of watching without interfering. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. She opened the door before his fist reached the frame. He nodded once and handed her a sealed envelope, thicker than it needed to be. "We're exercising quiet jurisdiction under Article 17, Subdivision E," he said. She nodded back, having read enough old field guidelines to understand what that meant. It wasn't an arrest, and it wasn't assistance. It was extraction, for data, for verification, for control. It meant someone high enough up had decided the threads tied to her land were too woven into larger fabric to be left unattended. Inside the envelope were instructions, untraceable server locations, drop protocols, and 3 names written on a separate sheet, all unfamiliar. She read through the packet twice, then took out her own files, everything she'd collected, printed, and photographed. She burned hard copies and encrypted the rest. The man waited outside the entire time, saying nothing. When she handed him the USB drive, he placed it inside a heavy plastic case and clicked it shut. "This is no longer yours," he said, "and what's been done here isn't yours to fix." She said nothing. She already knew that. That night, her phone buzzed once with a coded message. "Asset redeployed. Containment initiated. Visible presence not advised." She powered the phone off, wrapped it in foil, and buried it behind the shed. The next morning, the trench was gone. Not filled in, but erased. The soil had been replaced with imported gravel, and the edges had been trimmed back so smoothly it looked like the work of industrial machines. The fence line had been reinforced with fresh wood, too clean, too precise. She walked the boundary in silence, noting every new post, every new wire, every unnatural line. Her property looked the same from a distance, but it wasn't. It had been cleaned, sanitized, filtered. Gloria called that afternoon. Her voice was hushed but not panicked, just weary. "I've been informed unofficially that the spiritual use designation has been retracted retroactively. Your citations have been annulled. The debt notice is voided. Your land's classification has reverted." Willow asked who retracted it. Gloria paused. "No one who'll sign their name. Just sources. Someone's closing the book." Willow thanked her and ended the call. She didn't ask any more questions, but the silence that returned wasn't comforting. Because things had shifted, yes, but not disappeared. They'd merely moved. Late that evening, she walked to the site where the urns had once been. No trace remained. Not a single scrap of plastic, not a candle stub, not a single print in the gravel. The stone she had used to cover the burned photo was gone. In its place was a smooth ceramic tile embedded into the ground, its surface blank except for a hairline crack across the center. No name, no symbol, just presence, an echo of something unspoken. And then came the letter. No return address, no markings. Inside was a single printed line on expensive watermarked paper. "You stood still longer than expected. Most don't. That changes things." There was no threat, no accusation, just acknowledgement, a signal that she had been measured and marked and, in some way, left standing. But standing did not mean safe. It simply meant seen. The next day, the county office called and asked if she was available for a land use reassessment review. The voice was polite, almost cheerful, explaining that her parcel had been randomly selected as part of a statewide audit for tax adjustments. She declined, firmly. Later, she drove into town and withdrew every physical copy of her land documents from the bank's archive locker. When the clerk raised an eyebrow at the suddenness, Willow offered only a tight smile. She packed the papers, scanned them again at home, and locked the originals in a fireproof case, which she then buried beneath the old compost pit, now cleared and dried. What disturbed her wasn't that someone had tried to take her land. It was that they had tried to rewrite its meaning, turn it into something symbolic, communal, abstract. It was no longer about property lines, it was about control through ritual, bureaucracy, and confusion. It was about bending reality just far enough that even the firmest ground felt like sand. And for a time, it had worked. They'd gotten deep, but not deep enough. When she walked the perimeter now, it wasn't to check for intrusions. It was to memorize again what she'd nearly lost. Not the acreage, not the title, but the certainty that she existed here, that her presence had weight, that her silence had edges that could cut. And those who had tried to reshape her life into a hollow sanctuary had learned something they hadn't expected, that she would not respond with noise, with panic, or with pleading. She had responded the only way she knew would last. She had endured, and somewhere, in some sterile office or quiet room, someone now had to explain why she was still here, why their process had failed, and why one quiet woman on one quiet piece of land had not vanished the way the others had. Months passed. The earth settled, the grass regrew, and the boundaries of Willow's land returned to what they had always been, unmarked by ceremony, untouched by hollow purpose. Yet beneath the surface, nothing was quite as it was before. There were no more signs, no more tents, no more names whispered over plastic urns, but the weight of what had almost taken root remained. Willow no longer received strange mail, and the registry never contacted her again. Her name vanished from every platform where it had been used without consent. The man from the SUV never returned. Gloria informed her that her file had been archived without a traceable docket. Everything had been made to disappear, methodically, like chalk scrubbed from pavement after a storm. She began to keep the gates locked, not out of fear, but discipline. Routine became ritual. Walking the perimeter at dawn, inspecting the soil, recording wind patterns, taking soil readings not because she needed them for work, but because the data anchored her. Her land had almost been overwritten by belief systems she had never agreed to, transformed into a shrine for a story she did not live. Taking its measurements again was her way of reaffirming reality. It was hers. Not in symbol, but in substance. The only remnant that remained was the ceramic tile. She never removed it, she never touched it, but she never stepped on it either. It stayed where it had been set, undisturbed, a reminder not of defeat or victory, but of recognition. Someone had seen her, tested her, and in their silence had acknowledged what no formal letter could admit. She had outlasted them. She had not been moved. Occasionally, trucks passed on the road, slow and unfamiliar, their drivers glancing just a moment too long at her driveway. When that happened, Willow stood still on her porch, arms crossed, watching. They never stopped. They never came back. And sometimes, when the night was particularly quiet and the wind pressed just right against the pine, she thought she heard footsteps at the fence line, far off, retreating, as if someone had come to check that she was still there, and finding her unmoved had turned away.